So hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have such a wonderful group of people here with us today. And we are very happy to welcome Professor Linda Steg, who is here with us today to talk about contemporary research in behavioral science and how to solve environmental problems using behavioral science. And some of you may remember Professor Steg from last year's ACBS conference, where she gave a lecture to open the conference, which was, I suppose, rather significant for our troubling times when environmental problems have become more and more crucial. So it was a lovely sign when ACBS conference began with such a topic. So Professor Steg is a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Groningen. Linda is also a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences and the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Linda was a lead author of the IPCC special report, and I hope that today we will learn more about how natural and behavioral sciences can unite to solve our difficult problems that we'll have to face. So happy to introduce Linda to you. Hi, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for attending. And I'm happy to be able to share some of our research with you. And if you have any questions in between, feel free to ask them, but I will also make sure we have ample time to discuss afterwards. So the talk is focusing on climate action. Like you already heard, I was contributing to the IPCC special report, but also to the last AR6 report that has just been released. It was all over the media in the Netherlands, probably also in your country. Yes. And one of the figures my screen didn't respond to my pushing, but now it does. So you probably are aware of this figure. It appeared many times in IPCC reports, indicating how greenhouse gas emission has been increasing, mostly during the last the century. And scientists are more and more sure that this is not a natural phenomenon, but that these increases in emissions are due to human behavior, and that this results in major environmental and climate risks. And you probably are all aware of some of these risks appearing in your country, because in the previous Working Group 2 report, one of the conclusions was also climate change is happening and it will affect everyone in the world increasingly. So before I start what motivates people to act, I would like to ask you, do you think that people are aware of this? Do they acknowledge that climate change is happening, and do they acknowledge it's caused by human behavior? Like I said, in the researchers, the scientists are almost completely sure, which is hardly ever happening, right? They are quite sure that this is happening, and it's anthropogenic, caused by human behavior. So my first question, what percentage of a sample of a big European research with samples of 1,000 or so respondents per country thinks climate change is not happening? Yes, think about it for a little bit. And the next question, what percentage would think it's not caused by human behavior? Well, when I ask these questions, I oftentimes get percentages like 20, 30, 40, 60% even of the population denying climate change. And this is actually not the case. So this wide European survey, which is already conducted 3 years ago, indicates that it's only 2% of this population, representative population sample, that does not think climate change is happening. And similarly, there's only a very small minority thinks it has nothing to do with human behavior. Most think it's 50-50. Well, it's actually mostly caused by human behavior. So there's some work to be done, but you might say that the problems we are facing are not mainly due that people don't recognize or accept climate change is happening. The question is more, how can we make sure that people act in line with these perceptions that they obviously have. Well, if we think about climate mitigation behavior, and that is behavior that would help reduce climate change, help increase temperature increases across the world, there are many things that we individuals can do in different roles. We can accept that a wind park is being built close to our home, or install solar PV if we are lucky ones and have a roof available. We can recycle instead of putting everything on the waste where it's being burned. Energy efficient appliances, or insulate our homes so that we need to use less heating or cooling. We can change our behavior, like line drying our laundry instead of using a tumble dryer. Transport ourselves in more climate friendly ways, so less driving, and if we drive, rather use an electric vehicle than a gasoline driven car. Fly less, use more public transport, or cycle or walk even. We can also change our diets, particularly meat and dairy consumption. So animal-based food proteins have a high climate impact. And we can also urge policymakers to implement policy that would help limit climate change by protesting or by voting for parties that are likely to implement climate policy. And the recent IPCC report indicated that the most influential behaviors that we can engage in is energy saving at home. So insulate our home properly or use renewables to generate electricity. Dietary shifts, so less animal-based products, and changes in mobility behavior would have major impacts. But because so many things are relevant, and if we want to limit climate change without capturing CO2 in the underground or so, we would need to adopt many of these behaviors. We are particularly interested in what motivates people to engage in many of these behaviors over and again. And the factor that we look into, particularly, well, multiple factors, but one that I focus on today are values. And we define values as general goals that people strive for in their life. So what you generally think is important in your life. And for sustainable behavior, there's four types of values particularly relevant. Two of these make people focus on their own interest, their self-interest. That's hedonic values, we want to have a pleasurable life. Egoistic values, we want to enhance our resources. And in many cases, climate action is not the best option if you have strong hedonic or egoistic values, because doing something to protect the environment, to limit climate change, is oftentimes rather costly, like insulating your home or buying an electric vehicle, or it is a little bit cumbersome or effortful. Insulating your home again, but also many people prefer to drive rather than traveling by public transport, for example. There's also two types of values that make people focus on their collective interest, so benefiting others or the environment. So altruistic values, we are also interested in the well-being, enhancing the well-being of other people. And biospheric values, many people care about the environment and are motivated to protect the environment. We studied, not only us here in Groningen, but many people across the world. I need to look, so my phone is ringing. So many people across the world did studies on these values and in different parts of the world. And what we generally see that people endorse all these types of values to some extent, because these are relevant for many people. But in many countries, people care about nature and the environment. They strongly endorse biospheric values. And the more they do so, the more likely they are to act pro-environmentally. So not only in the Western world, like in the Netherlands or Norway, but also in Eastern European countries, like in Hungary and Russia, we did studies, Lithuania, but also in Asia, countries like Japan, for example, in the US, in Argentina, in Iran, but also among poorer populations. So we did some studies in Mexico, around Mexico, among poorer populations, and also in 2 African countries. And what we generally find that people in all these countries endorse biospheric values. The more they do so, the more likely they are to act pro-environmentally. It may be for a different reason, because some sociologists argued like caring about the environment is a luxury good. You only will do so if your basic resources are fulfilled, if your basic needs are fulfilled. It may be that among poorer populations, people care for the environment, more about the environment, because they rely more on the resources, so they are more dependent on nature. That's something to be explored in future research. Now, from the same European survey that I just showed you, you can see here that people across Europe, all these European countries, including Israel, that's always in a European survey, not a European country, of course, but you see that people quite strongly endorse altruistic and biospheric values. So they seem to care more about the interest of others than about their own interest, and particularly egoistic values. Well, let's now see what are the common approaches that are followed to promote climate action. Well, oftentimes, one of the prominent strategies that you all might recognize is information provision. If we tell people what is the good behavior, why it's important to act on climate change, they will act accordingly. Another prominent strategy is providing rewards and punishment make pro-environmental behavior, climate action, more attractive, and people will do it. And it can, for example, be via financial instruments. These target individuals' extrinsic motivation. You provide an additional reward or a punishment. I will give examples of both strategies, and then I will go into the potential role of intrinsic motivation as well. So, in environmental campaigns, information campaigns, they're all over the place. You find them everywhere all the time. And what meta-analysis and reviews consistently find is that providing information is important to enhance awareness, to make people more knowledgeable, but hardly ever is successful in changing behavior as well. How come? Well, first, this is not the only information people get. They also get information of climate skeptics, and they're quite prominent in the media if you compare it to the number of people who deny climate change. But it's often appealed to in media. So this is something that you need to balance the pro-environmental information with. Another reason is the following, and I show you a movie to demonstrate what I mean, and then I explain what you have seen.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs. No.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away. It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you? Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, son.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Yeah, so why I showed you this movie is to illustrate how values steer our information processing. So depending on which values are most prominently endorsed, people attend to different aspects of choices and they make different decisions. So people are most attentive to consequences that are most relevant for the values they prioritize. Let me give you an example based on an experiment that we did. Among a general population sample of the Dutch population, half of the sample saw a documentary about the negative impact of bottled water. And these are not only the plastic that is being used, but also because a lot of energy is used to transport the bottled water to your homes or to the supermarkets. You can buy Australian water in the Netherlands and probably the other way around, for example. The other half of the sample saw an unrelated movie. And next, both groups were asked about their awareness, the knowledge about the negative consequences of bottled water. They were also asked about whether they intended to use more tap water instead of bottled water, and whether they would accept policies that would make the use of bottled water less attractive. And what we found, similar to what I previously indicated, what meta-analysis on information provision generally reveal, it is across the sample, those who viewed the documentary on the negative impacts, they were more knowledgeable about the negative consequences of bottled water, but there were no differences in intentions and policy acceptability between the two experimental groups. Then we looked into the role of biospheric values. Would it matter if you strongly endorse biospheric values or not? It did. So for people with relatively weak biospheric values that saw the documentary, they were more knowledgeable, but they didn't have stronger intentions, or they didn't support policy more than people that saw the unrelated documentary. For people with high biospheric values who care a lot about nature and the environment, people who saw the documentary were not only more knowledgeable, they also indicated they would try to reduce the use of bottled water more, and that they would be more, would support policies aimed to reduce the use of bottled water more than the control group. So it seems that information is particularly motivating those who are already motivated to act, who care about the environment. For them, the information provides additional knowledge and they act upon it. If you don't care so much about the environment, then the information does not motivate you to act. So preaching before the choir, right? Okay, let's move to the second strategy that is commonly used, the use of incentives. Make climate actions more affordable, provide subsidies, or emphasize that climate unfriendly behavior is rather costly. So let me explain an experiment that we did, and while I explain it, think about what you think would be the most effective strategy to, in this case, this experiment, promote tire pressure checks. If the tires of your car are properly inflated, you use less gasoline, and that means you save money, but you would also emit less CO2. And the question is, what would motivate drivers most to check their tire pressure? Should we emphasize this is good for the environment because you emit less CO2? Is it better to emphasize it's good for your wallet, you save money, and there's a control condition without any arguments? So think a little bit what you think would be most effective. And when I ask this question to different audiences, psychologists, other scientists, policymakers, the general public as well, most people think the financial appeal would be most effective. Yeah, because it's tangible. You have it immediately in the pocket. You can immediately do something without it. Everyone understands what a dollar saved would be. What we found is that the environmental appeal was most effective. Even though many people would not know what a kilogram of CO2 is, it was the most effective. How come? Well, two potential reasons. We did some follow-up studies with the questionnaire studies in different parts of the world. First, what you see here is that many behaviors that we do on a daily basis would save a little bit of CO2 or a little bit of money. And if you ask people, to what extent do you think this behavior is worth the effort? And does this depend on whether we emphasize money or CO2 reductions? You see that people find the exact same behavior in this study, eco-driving behaviors. They find it more worth the effort if you emphasize the CO2 emission reduction compared to the money saved. So people think, yeah, I can check my tire pressures. I would save a few bucks per year. Well, not worth the effort. Minor saving, leave it. Well, they think it's more worth the effort if you emphasize it would protect the environment. How come? Well, this is mostly because doing something good for others or the environment makes us feel good. And this is a very old notion that Aristotle already proposed. He called it eudaimonia. We not only get happy, our well-being is not only enhanced by doing nice things, hedonic well-being, but also, and maybe even more so, if we do meaningful things, contributing to the greater good. So acting sustainably, protecting the environment, limiting climate change feels good because we do something meaningful. And people feel better about the same climate action if they engaged in it on a voluntary basis, if they chose to do it themselves, because then they can attribute the behavior to their own identity, and it was not forced upon them. And also people with stronger biospheric values feel better about acting on climate change. And this is not only social desirability, it's not only that people think, oh, let's tell the researcher I care about the environment because that's probably what he or she wants to do. We find the same effects when we measure it implicitly. And the process is, if you engage in a sustainable behavior, you think you do something meaningful, that reflects positively on you, and that elicits a positive feeling. And a nice thing is that if people anticipate feeling good about the behavior, they're more likely to act accordingly. So anticipated effect is an important driver of our behavior. So it would be good to emphasize that people do many good things for the environment. And there's also a notion in economics that emphasizes that doing something good for others, it was mostly on altruistic behavior, makes people feel good. And Andreoni, the economist, indicated that he referred to this as a warm glow. Doing something good for others provides a warm glow. And one of our PhD students wanted to know, is this just a metaphor or might people literally feel warmer? So what he did, put people in a lab and asked them to complete a CO2 calculator. And after that, they were provided with feedback on their CO2 footprint, so to speak. And they either learned that it was a relatively high footprint, indicating they were relatively not so environmentally friendly, or they learned you are relatively good, your score is much lower than average. And then he asked people to report the room temperature of the room they completed the experiment. And in the first study, the room was the psychology lab in our cellar, not very controlled circumstances. In the second study, he was able to run the study in climate-controlled rooms of the biology department, meaning that the room temperature was actually kept constant. And this is what he found. When people learn, they acted relatively pro-environmentally, they literally feel warmer. They indicate the temperature in the room is higher than when they learned they were acted relatively poorly, were acting climate unfriendly. He also measured, he found this in both experiments. He also tried to see whether this was also visible in the physiology by using the devices that were put on people's fingertips so that you can actually measure body temperature. And then the effect was less pronounced. He only found it in the first experiment among female respondents. Well, two issues there. The human biologists with whom we collaborated in this study indicated, yes, of course, you only find it among female participants. We only run studies among female participants because this is about how fast your blood vessels respond to all kinds of stimuli. And this happens faster among females. So you should not have included male students in the first place. The second issue is that in the first study, the sample was larger, so we had more power. So I'm not sure whether it was just accidentally that we found it in the first study or whether there is an effect, but really a small effect. But I think the most important message is anyway that it is about perception, and perception drives our behavior more than facts, right? Good. So he also looked into the process, and it's indeed, like I indicated with eudaimonia, if you act relatively pro-environmental, this reflects positively on you, you feel good, it sends a positive self-signal, and this makes that you think the room temperature is higher. Okay, a few more things I want to say, because now I mostly focused on people care about the environment, they act accordingly most of the time, but not all the time, because if that was the case, the IPCC would no longer be needed because there would no longer be a climate problem, right? While climate change is increasingly, or is still very prominent and increasing actually. So is there another route that we can follow to promote pro-environmental actions, climate actions? Yes, there are. I will indicate some. And then in the end, I will focus on one more reason why people might not always act in line with what they find important. But let's first look what alternative pathways there might be. One of these is via environmental self-identity. And environmental self-identity reflects the extent to which people see themselves as a pro-environmental person. The stronger people's environmental self-identity, the more likely they are to act sustainably, because we are motivated to act in line with how we see ourselves. We want to be, or at least appear to be, consistent. So our identity drives our choices. The environmental self-identity is stronger when people strongly endorse biospheric values, because I find it important to protect the environment. So I see myself as a person who does this, and that affects our choices. But it also depends on our previous actions. So if you realize you acted pro-environmentally many times before, you always have a stronger environmental self-identity. If you realize you did not act sustainably before, your environmental self-identity will be weakened and you're less likely to act accordingly. And what was often done in campaigns is emphasizing the many things people don't do. Often people don't save energy, people don't cycle to work, they drive too much. Well, given this theory and these findings, you would say it's important to indicate that many people do something. And that's actually what the Dutch government started to do. Ellen van der Werf, our lecturer in our group now, advised them on this campaign. They have a campaign with the slogan, "Everyone does something," emphasizing that many people already do something, hoping this will strengthen their environmental self-identity and promote future actions. Another factor that might play a role, and related to this, the symbolic value of consumption is important as well. We not only consume because we think it's sensible, or it saves money, or it's good for the environment, but maybe also because it tells something about who we are to self and to others. And we wanted to see in a study, does this symbolic value also affect the choices we make? Well, if you ask people to what extent does it affect your behavior, what you see clearly in this figure, people say, no, not so important for me. The score is below the midpoint of the scale. In this study, it's about whether people would become a member of a local energy initiative, but we found similar findings if you ask people, would you buy an electric vehicle? people tell you, I do this because it's good for the environment, or because it's a sensible thing to do, it saves money, or it's convenient, but not because it tells something about who I am to self or others. But then let's see what drives their actions. And you see that what predicts whether they would become a member is not so much the instrumental function. It is because it's good for the environment, but it's also the signaling function. So if you think, oh, buying an electric vehicle tells something about me to self and others, you're more likely to drive or to consider buying an electric vehicle. This is even more so the case when you think the electric vehicle has some advantages. Because if you're willing to cope with the advantages, the signaling function will enhance, right? Because you do not just copy or do not just a sensible thing, you do something because it really tells something about who you are. The groups in which we function, the people around us also affect choices that we make. And I give you two examples of how this might work. First, the groups in which we function is, for example, a prominent group that we all encounter mostly on a, well, not on a daily basis, but a regular basis at least, is the company for which we work. And this study wanted to see whether it matters whether the company for which you work endorses corporate environmental responsibility, and that was operationalized, defined as the extent to which the company finds it important to protect the environment and acts accordingly. And what was found, and it was also studied whether this is relevant next to biospheric values that I introduced before. What was found is at first, people with strong biospheric values not only are more likely to act sustainably at home, but also at work. So these values indeed affect choices in many different situations. Second, people are more likely to act pro-environmentally if they think their organization is committed to reduce its environmental impacts. So it matters. If you are involved in groups that care about the environment, you're likely to do so as well. Most importantly, it was found that this corporate environmental responsibility particularly promoted sustainable behavior among those who do not care that much about the environment themselves. Because people with strong biospheric values, they would do it anyway. People with relatively weak biospheric values, they benefited from a goal of the company to act more pro-environmentally because they adopted the goal of the company as their own goal. So this is a way to promote sustainable actions among the less motivated people. Well, more generally, we are influenced by the choices other people make. That is well known from the concept of social norms, that we tend to copy the behavior that is done by many people because we figure out that is the most sensible thing to do. But it's not only copying behavior. If you see, or if you are in an environment that signals many people don't care about doing the right thing, doing the appropriate thing, it might inhibit your own good acts. Let me demonstrate this with on the basis of a few field experiments done in the city that I live in, Groningen. First experiment was the aim was to see whether people were more likely to litter a flyer in an environment that clearly signals other people don't care about doing the right thing, or a clean environment indicating people care. And the flyers were put on a place on a handlebar of bicycles where it was very uncomfortable. So people had to decide to do something with it. It was not easy to cycle away with it. And what was found is that in a clean environment, the flyer was littered 33% of the time. But in an environment that signals many people don't care, graffiti on the wall in this case, almost double the amount of people littered the flyer. And the flyer, by the way, it was not a keeper. It was a very ugly, basic leaflet. So how far does this effect go? Well, we replicated in many studies, and it was even found that people were more likely to steal an envelope with money in an environment that signals that people don't care, compared to a clean environment. Let's now look at the other side. Would it also work the other way around? If you are in an environment that clearly signals that people do care, are you then more likely to act appropriately and do the right thing as well? So this was an experiment where there's one participant, and that's what you see in the photo, the girl who picks up the oranges. These are all colleagues in that time, so this is not a real photo of the experiment. But there's one participant that walks towards us, and when he is almost passing a person with a bicycle, that person with a bicycle is fiddling around and accidentally dropped oranges. And out of sight, there's a Confederate telling, just looking, observing what is being done. Is this person helped by picking up the oranges, or do people just pass by? And does it depend on what happens before? First condition, nothing happened, control condition. Second condition, this before entering this scene, the participant passes a person who drops a soda can, picks it up again, demonstrating I care, I don't litter. And the third condition, that's what you see here, is that he passes a person who is sweeping the sidewalk, cleaning up litter produced by other people. Clearly showing I care. I even remove litter produced by others. And it matters. So you see again, in a clean environment, far less people were helping, and the amount doubles almost again in the most extreme condition where you pass someone sweeping the sidewalk. So showing good behavior can also encourage other people to do the right thing as well. Well, the final thing I want to say about why people might not always act upon their climate beliefs or their biospheric values is that one of the things is that it's not always feasible or attractive in the systems we function today. So many times climate action is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or not even possible or very costly. So it is also important to create environments, contexts that make climate actions affordable and feasible. So if you want people to cook plant-based meals, it's important that they understand how a nice vegan or vegetarian meal would look like. If you want people to drive electric cars, you need to take care that a charging infrastructure is in place. People will not travel by public transport if there's not a good public transport network available, or not cycle if there is no safe cycles infrastructure available. Sometimes you need to provide subsidies to enable, especially people with lower incomes, to invest, for example, in solar PV. And recycling facilities are a prerequisite if you want people to recycle. So the basic message here, behavior change is not only the responsibility of individuals, companies, governments need to act as well to make sure that climate action is affordable and feasible. Well, if you want to implement such changes, it's important that these changes are supported by the public. So public acceptability is important. And here again, it's not only a matter that people are egoistically driven, that they only find things acceptable if they're better off than before. People also care about whether costs and benefits are distributed in a fair way. And that's what, at least in my country, there's a lot of discussions about. We want to transition away from gas, so people need to invest in their homes, for example, to insulate their homes. And the main discussion is not it's expensive. The main discussion is it's not fair because poor people can't afford to make such investments. Well, fair procedures are also important, that people are able to have a say, or at least see that their concerns have been taken seriously. And trust in the agents implementing the change is also very important. And yeah, many people don't trust the government that that much, so that can be a tricky issue. And more, the final thing I want to say, sometimes people are too negative about changes beforehand, so trials can also be important. And I can demonstrate it based on a study done in Stockholm, Sweden, where they implemented the congestion charge. Before implementing the scheme, many people were not so much in favor of the scheme. The majority opposed the scheme. They had a system in place for 6 months. And after that, the public in the area could vote in favor or against the scheme in a referendum. And what was found that in the referendum, the majority voted in favor of a scheme. So they voted in favor of a scheme that implied that they have to pay more for driving into the city. And what was also found is that they were more negative about the consequences before the trial than after it was implemented. So after experiencing it for 6 months. Traffic jams reduced more than they anticipated. Environmental benefits were larger than they anticipated. Parking problems were solved more than they anticipated, and they paid a little bit less than they anticipated. So trials that make people experience what a change entails can also raise public transport when people see positive changes happen. So conclusions, multiple motivations affect climate actions. Intrinsic motivation is also an important base for consistent climate action. So you don't only need to rely on extrinsic motivators. It's important to create contexts that activates and support biospheric values and that offer other benefits as well, besides of environmental benefits. And acceptability of changes and policies is higher when these policies and changes are fair and when trust is high. Thank you for your attention. I always show pictures of the group because this is truly teamwork. So thanks to colleagues in the group that I'm able to present this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was amazing to learn more about your research. We have another 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. If you have any comments to share or questions to ask, now is a good time.
I have a question.
Good, go ahead.
Good. So I'm wondering about what kind of training in values. It can either be enhancing values that people already have or taking them from zero and enhancing it and making them, cultivating them. So like, you know, an awareness of interdependence or compassion for others suffering. There was an interesting study that came out. So I'll stop there, but I'm just curious about there, and obviously it's individual differences, but specific, even maybe person-specific types of training that move motivation just enough to change behavior.
Yeah,
I'm sure you've already thought about this.
Yeah, excellent question. I thought about it, but I never tested it. So
oh,
there,
good.
No,
we have a study to do.
Yes, we
Together.
do. Yeah, no, there's some studies that show that values do change, because the common understanding is values are formed during your youth or adolescence mostly, and then they're relatively stable. But there are studies showing that value systems do change when people encounter major life changes in their lives. So that they're triggered to reflect on their values again. For example, if they move to a different country. But they don't change easily because values function as truism. We take them for granted. We hardly ever reflect on it. So I think my hypothesis, to be tested, is that you need to ensure that people start reflecting on their values. And it can be done by intensive education programs, for example, or intensive experiences. So I hope to test this soon, because I will join an expedition ship that goes to the Arctic. And I want to, and there you can really see that the climate is changing, right? Because the average temperature at the world increased by 1.1 degree now, but in the Arctic it's 3 or more even. So the changes are far more dramatic. And I want to see what and kind of seeing these changes, experiencing it during a longer trip, whether this makes people reflect on their values, discuss it with other people on board, and whether this changes their value system. I would expect it might, but needs to be proven and shown.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, do you have suggestions?
I have some ideas. Actually, I have 2 research meetings after this to talk about different ways of shifting people's behaviors. But an interesting study just came out that showed like mindfulness meditation, just a short dose, actually, in some cases, actually gets people to blunt and avoid their negative emotions, whereas loving kindness contemplation, and it was just brief, which is a whole other issue, what dose is needed, actually makes people more other person centered. But even further than that is understanding the interdependence of each action that I take is not isolated.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what kind of training, what kind of languaging, context and culture, language specific, really helps people have an experience of the interdependence that then makes them shift.
Yeah.
So I'm actually thinking about doing something like this.
Yeah, excellent.
And
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
And just to plant the seed, because maybe we need you. There's a University of California 10 campus wide initiative with Alyssa Eppel, who's a clinical psychologist, to actually do climate training people to be climate activists. So I'm immediately thinking we need someone like you.
Yeah, well, a clinical psychologist is also helpful. I think but exactly what you just indicated is about the interdependency that is critical. And that is not well understood and overlooked, I think, in literature as well. Because if we want to limit climate change, everyone needs to change at the same time, and you need to understand how the system changes are elicited. And that's a tricky thing. So I think we need to collaborate on this.
And Martin has his finger up.
Yeah,
nice.
I think that's such an important point, the languaging, and also how the system itself operates, and what are societal values as well. I think your presentation focuses mostly around individuals' behavior and individuals as consumers, if you like. But whilst we're still, whether we like it or not, considered to be individual consumers, then societally speaking, our relationship with nature continues to be exploitative, and what can we extract from it, and what financial cost, what benefit can our shareholders accrue from it. So ultimately, the bigger change must come from a change of societal values, where when we're looking at the cost of things, it's not just about how much it costs to insulate your home, but how much it costs environmentally or ecologically not to.
Yes.
So that kind of languaging starts coming into our calculations, really. And then with regard to the words that we use in ACT, we have the idea of self as context, which has been extraordinarily helpful in our approach to helping alleviate the suffering of others. And I would dearly love to see us in the ACT learning community adopt the term the ecological self as well, and just look at quite how that might function when it comes to looking at ecological values from the ecological self, because that really is owning our ecological values, rather than as an individual, in a way, aspiring to have ecological behavior. And I feel the ownership of ecological valuing, if we knew how to get into our ecological self, would be so much more solid. And I think there's a big debate to be had about that in in the future or even now?
Yeah, no, yeah, also excellent thoughts and suggestions. Yeah, but the language matters indeed, but also what you said, what is now currently often done, at least in political debates, it's the narrative that some, well, not leaders, but politicians follow is either we do something to limit climate change and we will have a horrible life, or we do nothing and everything will remain the same. But that's not true, of course. So I think it's also important to communicate more clearly what the options are. So also what will happen if we don't act and how the world would look like then and what it would cost us to adapt to climate change, because that will be very expensive as well, so that people can make a better choice of what world they would like to live in. Yeah.
I had another thought, because we're experiencing with our daughters, our 2 children, the more that we talk about and demonstrate climate-friendly behaviors, train rather than flying, veggie versus meat. It's so interesting. Now our 11 and 14-year-old daughters, like, we actually see their thinking manifest based on the parental influence, the little influence we have. And I'm wondering, that's a whole other dimension with, within the family, and then within an organization. So if I've thought about gaming, where you have 10 divisions in a company and you say, okay, let's compete with each other to see who has a division with hundreds of employees per division, who can compete to have the lowest carbon footprint. That brings a gaming and competition, which is not necessarily the best motivation, but it might actually shift behavior.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
Yeah. Yeah, but the first, what happens within families and groups is really important and is increasingly being studied, luckily. That can also be the other way around, because I also collaborate with some NGOs that provide education programs at school, hoping that the children affect the choices of their parents. So it can also be the other way around. And also teach children what to do when parents respond reluctantly, what sometimes happens. With gaming, yes, I think it can really help. It can also have some disadvantages, so you have to really be careful on how to implement the game. Because there's one experiment that I remember, that there was a competition between, I think, dormitories or something at the university, where they competed with each other to use as little energy as possible. And what some of those people did, they did not shower at home, but at the gym. So not really reducing their impact, right? But just making sure it's not visible on the meter. So you have to be careful that you are also able to monitor these unexpected is not unwanted changes. Yeah, but it can make people experience change, and sometimes that matters. So sometimes a financial incentive, a really small one, can already be effective if it triggers people to try out a new behavior. And if they then see, oh, it has positive effects, they might choose to do so continuously. Yeah, I see a hand.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's been super interesting listening to you and also listening to the conversation you've had afterwards with the colleagues in the room. So I don't come from a psychology background, but I think it was really nice what you've just discussed, because I'm about to become a coach. So I'm currently training to become a coach, and I launched a workshop that basically is all about teaching people on how to change their behavior so they can be more sustainable. And what my natural thinking or my natural sense told me is start with an exercise that asks people to reflect on their values so they can understand what triggers you to make decisions about your consumerism, right? And I love to see that this is being discussed among psychologists and researchers like you as well, because I think it's a very relevant topic, and it really starts with understanding what your values are and what it takes to change them. So if if professors get engaged in research projects that try to back this based on facts, I'm just wondering how you can bridge this knowledge and all this research to the people or to educational systems like schools and universities, so they understand how to implement all the research that you produce, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, are you planning to teach this at universities, or are you planning to collaborate with governments to integrate this into educational systems? Because I think for me, the most important information as someone young that's trying to be an activist on different ways and really challenge people to change their behaviors. Yeah, I'm looking for the research that you provide to use it, but I think it's a very relevant question to understand how researchers bridge with other entities or companies or governments to spread the knowledge, spread the words, and understand how people can make the best use of it for themselves as well.
Also, excellent suggestion and question. Yes, I think many academic research is still being done in ivory towers, not communicating enough with potential users. It's increasingly being done, also being rewarded at universities. So it's part of evaluations now. And we try to do so. So we collaborate with a lot of practitioners in our projects who have an interesting question that inspire our research, but also making sure that our outcomes are easily implemented. I'm in all kinds of advisory bodies as well. But one of the things we recently did as well is based on a research line, we not only communicated it via papers or leaflets, but also developed a game. And by playing, and it's related to the gaming suggestion earlier, by playing this game, practitioners become aware of how a phenomenon works in practice and how they can deal with it. And this game was about understanding why sometimes people respond very emotionally towards innovations. And by playing this game, they understand that these emotions are not randomly or that people are not crazy, but they are just concerned about something, and trigger them to really understand what is happening and how they can deal with it. And that's something that we want to do more. So we now hired a communication officer who helps us to develop such more innovative communication channels, because that's clearly not my talent, but other people have those talents. So yeah, thanks. I see one more. Yeah.
Hello, Linda. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very clear, and I'm a big fan. I've read so many of your papers. In fact, we are just about to release the IPA's value assessment that talks about exactly how values relate to biodiversity conservation. And in that, we used the section that the very subsection that I was working in, looked at the behavior change wheel and the KNAW model of behavior. I don't know if you, okay, good. So my question is, do you have an opinion on that model? It brings in the KNAW model, for those who haven't heard, talk about opportunity, capacity, and motivation for a behavior to occur. But they talk about motivation with different terms like automatic and reflective. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on it, if you think it's helpful, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Also a very good question. Yeah, so I tapped onto it, but I labeled it differently. But I indicated in the end, it's not only a matter of motivation, right? The context should be favorable as well. And that is the opportunities in the motivation, opportunity, capacity. Capacity is more about knowledge and skills that you have. Those matter as well. And so it is, I fully agree that you can't rely on motivation only. You should also make sure that people can act, by understanding how to do it and by providing the opportunities. The letter where you refer to, whether that is about, most of the things I presented are more or less assuming that people make reasoned choices, that they reflect before they act, right? But many of our behaviors are indeed habitual automaticities, so triggered by a contextual cue. But it once was a reflective choice still. But I think habits are important as well, but I don't see habit as a different type of behavior. I just see it as, well, that's something that you do without thinking, but you can implement so that people start thinking again. So significant life events, for example, if you get children or move house, are moments that people might reconsider their habits, reflect again about pros and cons of choices, and end up with another choice. So a habit is more like you need more significant changes so that people start reflecting again, rather than it's a totally different type of behavior to consider. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, good. So I think you're saying that kind of context essentially changes behavior as well. So with the change in environment, move, so forth, we start reflecting, and so that can induce it. It's more like kind of the starting point, and whether we're receptive to that. Yeah, and so that's really how ACT works a lot, right? Trying to create the contextual change. I wonder where there's also a lot of talking about cap and trade from a sort of political societal models of how we it has different names in different countries, right, where it would increase taxes, right, for gasoline, and then that would kind of be sent through the system and returned as various benefits to the individual. I just wonder if what your thoughts about that is.
Yeah. Nice question again. Yeah, so that's basically a financial instrument, but you also consider how the revenues are being used, right? So financial instruments, well, I showed you sometimes they are not effective, but if the price is significant, everyone will respond to it, of course. So it's not that pricing doesn't help at all. And this revenue use is important to secure public support or to prevent outreach of the public. So by allocating revenues in a way that people think, okay, there's benefits as well, then it might enhance support. And we did some studies on that and others as well. And basically, people don't like these instruments if they have the idea that it is just public money spent to anything that the government deems relevant at that time, and because they don't trust the government probably. And so if it's just used for general public funds, people don't like that much. They do like it better if it would be given back to the public, so to themselves by, for example, you increase tax gasoline tax, but you reduce the tax for new cars or something. But importantly, they also accept it more if they are sure that the money is invested in environmental goals. And that is a promising thing. So it's not only, again, that they want to benefit themselves, but if they understand that the funds are, for example, being spent to research and development on pro-environmental innovations, they find it more acceptable as well.
That's encouraging.
Yes.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Linda.
Yeah, I don't see everyone at the screen, so just shout.
Sorry. I just wonder, we need to change in the global scale as soon as possible. And this kind of models that everybody trying to suggest here and you're explaining, they seem to me punctual and for locals. It's not a big scale. We don't have any big scale model to implement in others, in all the planet. Well, then I came across with something that already happened that changed behaviors, that technology and the social media and like Cambridge Analytics stuffs that change elections. So if we as a society already have, I know, some kind of people have this power, but have the power of change elections in many countries, and they have the power of the algorithm power of looking for the way the things that you are reading and put other things, then you are changing your way of thought. So that's my I came from journalism and psychology. So I mix the two of the things. When you put in this informations, something that's called attracts the emotions, change behaviors. So can we apply as in a global scale something like this, or as a researchers?
Yeah, nice question. I have two sides of to reflect on this. I indeed think that we can learn a lot from marketeers and these type of people active on social media trying to influence many people at the same time. At the same time, it might raise ethical issues, right? Because what we saw influencing the elections, that is not something that you would like for a society at large. So I think there's a fine balance there. And that's actually also my thought that I always have it. If I understand how I can change values, well, of course, we would use it for the better, but some people might use it for the worse. So there's also ethical questions related to these types of more fundamental changes that we should not forget. And luckily, philosophers are looking into, and ethics people are looking into these questions.
Because the ethics it's a value that changes with the time too. So I'm not trying to push us to a ethical discussion, but I'm looking for here is to understand how can we find something near that not bend the ethics and accelerate this process for us.
Yeah, what I always answer, because sometimes I got responses from policymakers that they don't like this type of research because they think we are moralizing people, and moralizing, when they use it, it's a bad thing. It's like pointing a finger at someone, thou should not. But as I see it, we're not moralizing people by telling them thou should do this and not that, but we are looking into what people find important and helping them to act in line what they already find important. And that's also what a philosopher, a colleague of mine, once said in relation to nudging, because that is also sometimes being disputed, because it is about moving people in the direction that they might not want to. And he then indicated, well, it is ethically okay if you move people in a direction that they would want to move in anyway, if they did reflect on it. So I think if you ensure that the changes that you implement, the strategies that you implement, are not conflicting with what people basically would want, or what society at large basically would want, then it might be ethically right. But I'm not an ethics person.
Okay, I will try a small modeling in small scale inside this thought that the people want to know, or the people that already are willing to change in this way, but it's a small scale. And we need change now.
But I totally agree with them. What two things that I want to say about it. Indeed, most of the research that is done in Western the world. So we know very little about how it's working in other parts of the world, and climate change is affecting everyone at the world. So we should see whether similar processes do play a role at other parts of the world. The second issue here is also that most problems, climate change is mostly caused by the Western world, while people who suffer from them are mostly not those who caused the problems. So that is also, again, an ethical dimension, a fairness, a distributional issue to consider as well. So in the IPCC report, it's also acknowledged that it might be that some people consume more and more because they are not able to consume at a basic level yet. And that means that other people would need to reduce even more if we want to limit climate change.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Victoria.
Hi, Linda. I got to see you speak at ACBS and just so appreciate you coming and talking to our group. Thank you. Our Climate Justice and Action SIG has a committee that is thinking about public policy and advocacy. And as I was watching your presentation, a lot of it's focused on individual behavior change, but I think I had some of the questions that Isadora had, or I was sort of thinking, all right, well, one of the ways to change at a broader scale is through government policy. Yeah. There's so much power there, right? So I was wondering, at first I was thinking, in terms of, in a way, trying to influence policy or lobby policymakers, it seems like emphasizing values is important. And yet what you just said was really interesting, like that there's a kind of don't moralize. And I'm just wondering, from your research, do you think, psychology and researchers could do more to influence policymakers, and how would we do that? Big question.
Yeah, excellent question as well. It's actually something that we started thinking about more and from different perspectives. So first, policymakers are also people in the end, right? So I'm interested in what drives their choices, and not only policymakers, also people in management positions in companies, for example. What drives their behavior, and are they only economically driven, which is often assumed? I don't think so, at least not people from these organizations and policymakers that I discuss with. The other thing is, well, two more things actually. The other thing is, it is also interesting to understand how they perceive the motivations of people, because in my presentations, I often encounter that they underestimate the level of support for changes. They underestimate how much people care about climate change, how much strongly they endorse biospheric values. So we are now looking into how different actors perceive the willingness and values of other actors. Because my idea is that everyone is too negative about the others, and that might paralyze everyone. So if a consumer thinks, yeah, I'm willing to act, but the government doesn't make it easy for me, or the companies don't provide the right products that would limit climate change. And companies think, yeah, I'm not bringing these products to the market because there's no market for it. Consumers want the cheapest options, not the most sustainable option. And policymakers think, yeah, people will yell at me or no longer vote for me if I implement climate policy. Then everyone is waiting for the other or not acting because they think others would not support it. So I'm now trying to do, we are trying to see how different groups of actors perceive each other. And if there are misperceptions, try to understand why, but also try to understand how to change it. And I think the last thing I wanted to say, there's of course a lot of lobbying going on from vested interest who lobby to make sure that their interests are not being challenged. And that is something I know little about. If you know political scientists who look into that, let me know, because I'm very much interested in how these processes work, but also how you can counterbalance it. Because I know, for example, in the European Union, you have lobbyists from the big companies very close to the parliament, the expensive places, and then far away from the parliament are the NGOs. And that already illustrates how influential they are. So I think understanding this lobbying is also very important.
Just a follow-up on that. You know, in the United States, I think this is also a pattern in Europe. So there's some research that said that 10 years ago, Republicans or people on the political right were supportive of environmental policy. And in the increased polarization, particularly in the United States post-Trump, what you see is actually a big decline in support of environmental policy. And I was really thinking about this in your slides around identity. I actually think there's a much stronger identification in opposition of liberal policies and so on. And again, how can we take this research on human behavior? And, you know, I think a little bit about like, we have to be able to bring along half of our, I'm in the United States, so half of our, you know, population who right now actually, it feels like a contradiction in their, you know, it's ego-dystonic for them to support sustainable action. So it's very worrisome to me. Can we bring some of our psychological research and knowledge to bear on that polarization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. I know that there is some research that shows that if you take a different angle, so climate change is very much polarized in the US, but if you think I think what they did is focusing on traditional values. So we should protect our history. Then conservatives are perfectly okay with the same policy, which they would oppose if you would introduce it as a climate policy. So it's also about framing the issue. And the other thing, that's something that we still need to look into, but we have data from the US. I don't think that there are many people who will say, I don't care about the environment at all. I don't endorse biospheric values. The controversy is about the ways to deal with environmental problems, how to manage them. And there's also some interesting research on that it's the Merchants of Doubt, is Orescus is her name. She draws also a parallel with the anti-smoking or what happens around smoking. There are vested interests who are afraid that if we admit climate change is happening, there will be all kinds of policy implemented that would limit freedom of choice. So to prevent that, better deny that climate change is happening. And if you can't deny it, at least create doubt, because as soon as you create doubt, there's no need to act because we're not sure yet. She did some very interesting analysis, historical analysis, and comparing what happened with the smoking, the anti-smoking or pro-smoking movements as well.
Thank you so much for this discussion. I'm a little worried about the time because we've kept you a bit longer than we agreed. So please let us know if you need to go already.
I have another meeting, but if there's one more question, I can answer it. Then I'll join my other meeting a little bit longer later. I enjoy this discussion very much.
Yes, we do too. Thais, would you like to ask the last question?
Yeah, well, I guess I was just gonna compliment what Linda was saying and to answer Victoria. There are groups that are quite involved. I guess it's more developed here in Europe. You know, you have the Belmont Forum, which are very active on implementing behavior change onto policy. In the UK, this has been going on for a long time. They have their first insertion in the health sector, but now environmental psychology is also really big. So there are places where we can discuss that and impact policy and etc. And also the behavior change wheel also integrates behavior change with interventions and policies. So it's a tool that I'm trying to understand more the applications of it, the practical applications of it, and test it out in the environmental sector, because it was also created in the health sector.
Yeah.
And just going back to the ethical reflection that I think it's very important that we talk about it. And even though we are not philosophers as researchers, we do need to be aware of what are the ethical issues or the values behind our research. So if we're only talking about people as consumers, what does that imply? I think that needs to be somewhere in our text, because it is very different, like you mentioned, Linda, in the southern, the other non-Westernized cultures. We need to be aware of that and be critical of that, right?
Yeah.
So it was just a general comment. Like, I do agree with you. It's a total different area of research, but we need to be aware and be putting that into our critical analysis of our own work, right?
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and also thanks for pointing out that indeed there is a lot of behavioral insight teams, they call it as well. So these are more people at governmental agencies or in governments, behavioral experts who act as a translator between the science and practice. And these are established in many different countries. It started in the UK, but they're now in other countries as well. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you again. It was lovely, and it's very, very inspiring to feel that such meetings serve not only as sources of information, but also work as networking events. Obviously, I hope that some of you get in touch with each other, and we would be very happy to stay in touch with you, Linda, and we hope to hear you again, maybe with new materials, new results, and we appreciate you being with us today.
Yeah, and thank you for a very interesting discussion and ideas. Much appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you,
Have
everyone.
a wonderful day.
You too. Hope to see you again.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.